Hello and welcome to Fat Kid Fit Bod. I'm your friendly neighborhood trainer, Noah Sage Zimmerman. I'm a professional personal trainer based in Los Angeles, California, and I help men and women build bodies that look and feel strong. This podcast will focus not just on physical health, but also mental health and the challenges that make it hard to prioritize your health. I'm here to tell you how you can eat delicious meals, travel, work, build strong relationships, be social, and live the life you want, all while building and maintaining a body you love. With the help of other professionals and people that prioritize health, I'm giving away my best practices and reviewing emerging research in health and fitness so you can feel your best, look your best, and live life to the fullest. All right, welcome back to episode 5, season 3 of Fat Kid Fit Bod. Today's very special guest is Rozeta Avetisyan, and she is currently working as a data scientist at Stanford Healthcare and School of Medicine. She graduated with her PhD in Molecular Physiology from UCLA, where she studied sex differences in fat tissue accumulation. Her PhD research focused on how the genetic differences between males and females lead to distinct fat tissue development and function. Her work was supported by the F31 predoctoral fellowship from National Institutes of Health. In her spare time, she enjoys yoga, reformer Pilates, dance, hiking, and backpacking. Please, everyone, help me welcoming Rozeta. Clap, 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 clap. Live audience isn't very active tonight. It is late. So how are you doing, Rozeta?
I'm doing really well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's been a nice long day, but I'm excited to have this conversation and learn a little bit more about the genetic differences and fat accumulations. So I would first, me and I'm sure the listeners would love to hear more about your story and how you first got interested in getting a PhD in molecular physiology.
Yeah, I was always interested in human biology and health. And honestly, when I started school, I thought I was going to be a doctor. I was going to be pre-med. And then I took my first human genetics class. And I think it really changed my perspective on a lot of things. I understood how important our genetic background is for controlling disease or any other conditions that we might be predisposed to. And I wanted to understand that better. And so I started as an undergraduate researcher in a cardiovascular lab. And during those years, I realized that I'm actually more of the scientist type rather than the doctor type. I wanted to actually ask more questions rather than use the information that I had to specifically treat a specific patient. I wanted to continue asking more questions and learning more and just push the boundaries of what's known. And I ended up doing the PhD. And one thing that kind of just influenced on the route for my PhD was the fact that I realized during my undergraduate training that in a lot of the scientific studies, females were historically underrepresented. They were not included in as many studies as males were. Actually, in majority of studies, only males were used. And but then when the drugs were discovered, of course, they were prescribed to females too, and we didn't know exactly how they would affect females a lot of the times beforehand. So and then I realized that was already changing, and I wanted to be part of that movement. And so the lab that I joined was a pioneer lab in that field. They were studying differences between males and females and how that would kind of be important to consider when you're setting up studies and when you're designing your experiments and how you should keep things in mind. And so I wanted to learn more about that. I wanted to understand how males and females are different and what are those differences and what do they lead to. And I was also very interested in metabolic disease. So I ended up combining both metabolic disease and my interest in sex differences and ended up doing my PhD in sex differences in adipose tissue field. And it's been really exciting.
I love that. And, before we start learning about sex differences and fat accumulation and metabolic disease, I would love just clarification around, why women are not represented fairly in studies. I know that, there are more studies coming up involving women, but from my understanding, it's largely because of how different women's physiology around hormones is from men.
Yes. one, it's really funny. I wish I could show you this photo. Every scientist that I know that studies sex differences will show this like super complicated machine with like super, like 100 buttons on it, and it'll be labeled as a female, and then there will be a male with one single button on it. So the females definitely a version can be more complicated with kind of the ovarian hormones, kind of like having this cyclic pattern during the female reproductive cycle, which is like every 30 days for the average human. But then again, within males, there's really large differences in the testosterone levels, and even during the males monthly, actually during a month within the males, the testosterone levels do rise and drop also. So I don't really think that's a good excuse to exclude females. Also, even if it's more complicated, right, we should still study them. We should, there are ways around it. And so NIH is becoming more and more, National Institutes of Health are becoming more and more aware of this. And they're starting to actually request whenever it's possible to include females. And if there's no females included in the studies, now it has to be really clearly defined as to why they weren't included.
Yeah, and like 50% of the population is women, and 50% of the population will be using those pharmaceuticals. So
exactly,
it makes sense that we find out how women respond to the drugs that they're given. And I think that's ridiculous. But I'm so happy that women are starting to be more strongly represented in science studies. And I think that's like a perfect transition into talking about the key, like other genetic difference between, I think we should clarify when we're saying men and women, we're talking about people born with the genitalia of either man or women.
Yes.
And so like the genetic differences between them, and starting with, the differences between them when it comes to fat accumulation, fat tissue, and possibly like development of metabolic disease.
Yeah, definitely. So like
Loaded question.
I got this. That was my thesis work, so I should be able to answer that one.
Crush
for sure. So yes, like you clarified, males, and for the sake of our today's discussion, are going to be the males that have the testes and testicular hormones. In addition to that, these are the males that will have the X chromosome and then a Y chromosome. And then when we speak about females, we will speak about the females who have the ovaries and ovarian hormones, as well as 2 copies of X chromosomes. And really, historically, when looking at studies or how the XX and XY chromosomes were viewed, they were thought to give rise, so XX chromosomes were thought to give rise to ovaries and function through the ovarian hormones. So that was supposed to be their main function. And then the XY chromosome complement was supposed to give rise to the testes, and that was supposed to be their main function. And so when humans looked at, or when researchers looked at males and females, and the differences between them, they would historically consider only the ovaries and then the testes, that they wouldn't consider the genetic differences between them. And the main differences lie in the 2 X chromosomes versus an X and a Y chromosome. But recently we started realizing that on the X chromosomes, there's a lot of genes that escape this X chromosome inactivation process in females. So most of the genes will be expressed from one X chromosome, but then certain genes will be expressed from both of the X chromosomes. So those genes will have higher expression levels in females compared to males. And vice versa, in males, they will have their Y chromosome, and on the Y chromosome, there are certain genes that have become different from the X chromosomes genes, and they have their own function. And honestly, on the Y chromosome, there's about 50 protein encoding genes, and most of those are involved in testes formation. So those give rise to the genitalia of the male. But at the same time, there are certain genes that have similar function to those genes on the X chromosome, so we will call them the homolog genes on the Y chromosome. And yet, when we compare the X and Y homologs, they have different levels of function. So that's also a difference between males and females. Now, going back to females with their 2 X chromosomes, So some of the genes that escape this X chromosome process and inactivation process and are at higher levels in females, a lot of these genes will include histone modifiers. So meaning that these are proteins that will change the shape of your DNA. And then as a result, they will turn on or turn off certain genes. So you have different gene expression levels as a result between males and females. And a lot of these genes are involved in many various processes, and some of those processes are metabolic related. And so we wanted to understand what those are and how those could be different between males and females. And that led to the understanding of, or like to my thesis work.
And, we know that, well, maybe the listeners don't know, but I think you and I know that men have a tendency to store or accrue is probably the better word, more visceral fat. And visceral fat's a fat that, it's the not great fat to have. It's, it probably influences a lot of metabolic disease, heart disease, etc. It's the fat that accumulates around our organs, where women have a tendency to generate more subcutaneous fat, which is the fat underneath our skin. So, I mean, beyond this is, our chromosomes and our DNA tell males to do, generate more visceral or accrue more visceral fat, tells females to accrue more subcutaneous fat. Is there anything that you've researched or seen why that is?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the genetic underlying mechanisms for why males tend to have more of the like the visceral fat, the fat that's in the belly and around the organs, or versus when females have the subcutaneous fat, like you mentioned, the fat that's in their gluteal areas or in the hips that gives them the pear-shaped physiology. We don't really fully understand which genes are kind of controlling that waist to hip ratio per se, but we do know that hormones control that greatly. So it seems like the genetic differences between males and females tend to more control about like the level of fat that develops between males and females. So for example, it seems like having higher dosage of certain genes like KDM5C, which is on the X chromosome, sets up a condition where you have higher body fat amounts to begin with. But we don't know if it necessarily controls the hip-waist ratio. Those studies haven't been done, or like the analyses haven't been done. I think some of the results that are available can be analyzed slightly differently to really understand that. But we do know that hormones affect that. For example, estrogens, they tend to affect the subcutaneous fat rather than visceral fat. So estrogen is, they call it like a growth hormone because it makes things grow. And so it makes your fat tissue grow, but specifically the subcutaneous fat. And then it seems like the genetic background of the humans on top of that helps control how much growth can we support, and how much of that growth is going to be healthy growth, and how much of that growth is going to be, unfortunately, unhealthy.
So it must have to do with reproduction, because post-menopause, women tend to stop storing as much subcutaneous fat and start storing more visceral fat. So there has to be some kind of like evolutionary advantage for women that are in the childbearing years to have more subcutaneous fat.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely sometimes viewed from that perspective because I guess if you are a female, or as a female who's going to carry a baby in her belly for about 9 months, she definitely doesn't have the space. Like I think even during pregnancy, a lot of the organs have to move around and to create space for the growing fetus. So definitely doesn't have a lot of the space to also house like extra visceral fat. But she does need all the fat storage to ensure, especially evolutionarily when food wasn't always available, right? There had to be a certain baseline level of fat that would signal to the brain, be like, yes, we're ready for, for a reproductive cycle, we're ready to produce a baby. So then her cycle would continue, and she had to store it somewhere. And I guess she ends up storing it in the subcutaneous area. She found a different way.
I'm curious, I maybe follow me down this thought process that, we know that it's really important. We know that women should not have, or they can, but it is extremely unhealthy for them to have as low body fat percentage as some men can get. And to a certain degree, it's extremely unhealthy for men to have a very, very low body fat percentage. But on a comparable level, women should not get as low as men based off how their body functions, hormones, etc. So we know when women are, extremely under eating, low body fat percentage, they have a tendency to lose their menstrual cycle. Beyond like the obvious of how terrible that is for a woman, or maybe correct me if I'm wrong if it's not terrible, but beyond it being so terrible, are there any, besides, say a woman doesn't want to have children, is there any advantages beyond just specifically storing more subcutaneous fat for women versus childbearing years? Is there a reason beyond that for them to, be okay with, having a higher body fat percentage than most men? If
That's
that
a
makes
really
sense.
good question.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so I think let me talk through your question and see if I really understood it. So are you asking if there's an advantage other than the reproduction for the female to have higher baseline body
Exactly.
fat? Is that
Yes. Yeah.
okay?
You just turned my very long question into something very easy to understand.
Well, you gave a lot of detail and
Yes.
a lot of like context, and I think that was important. But
Well, thank you.
I actually don't really know the answer to that. That's a really good question, and I wish I knew the answer. I'll do some research, and if I find anything, I'll add it to our
fact check.
I guess fact check.
I love it. I love it. Maybe this episode we'll call it our fat check.
I love it.
Because it is. I am curious because a lot of my female clients, come to me. They, a lot of them want to have, they have some have a desire to get a six pack, etc. And I never tell them that they shouldn't, but I often try to caution them around, when women get to that low body fat percentage, a lot of not so great things can happen. And, one of the first things
Depends
that can
on
happen
the context.
obviously depends on the context.
Yeah.
It's very contextual, but, unless you're not doing it for like professionally, like let's say you're not a professional female bodybuilder who is going to step on the stage, around, I guess, like 8, correct, I'll fat check this, but if it's, I think female bodybuilders get to around 6 to 8% low for them. For male it's like 2 to 3, but unless you're not stepping on stage,
That's good to know.
Unless you're not stepping on stage, there's no reason for male or female to get to that point. But I guess I'm wondering, I guess I'm just coming back to the question, is there any other advantages? Basically, it's just you don't want to lose your period. Because good, bad, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you don't have your period.
Now that I think about it, now that you're giving me a second chance.
Okay.
Yes, now that you're giving me a second chance at this question. I think when the baseline amount of fat for the female can be important, but regulating her hormones and just the estrogen and what we know, and like I feel like a lot of the female bodybuilders, I don't know if there's a lot of studies that follow them throughout their lifespan. I feel like it's more of a recent activity that females have been getting involved in, and so it's kind of hard to say how it would progress for them for the rest of their lifespan. We do know that men who tend to compete, I don't necessarily know if their lifespan is shorter than for males who don't compete, right? And they tend to do okay unless they're doing steroids. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I feel like sometimes you know better when it comes to this field than I do.
I mean, it's definitely that. I mean, all the big male bodybuilders that we know are definitely using performance enhancing drugs, steroids, and I think a lot of the early deaths have to do to. I mean, a lot of the bodybuilders that are dying recently were in like the kind of heyday, big days of bodybuilding when, to my knowledge, steroid use was not as regulated, not as they weren't as careful. They didn't really know what they were doing. There was a possibility of getting the steroid source from not great places. And I think in today's world, we know the advantages of testosterone replacement therapy, not just for men, but for women as well.
Right. Right.
But I think that male bodybuilders have a very short lifespan if they are using performance enhancing drugs like steroids. I think that certain metabolic disease like type 2 diabetes is more prevalent in men, and it definitely happens to a lot of women, but I'm assuming that it happens because of increased visceral fat.
It seems like that's the connection, or at least that's what we currently understand when it comes to the studies. So we do know that the visceral fat is not only different in its location from the subcutaneous fat, but the actual type of fat cell is very different. It's different when you look at it under the microscope. The physiology is different. It's different when you look at the gene expression. There's large gene expression differences between visceral fat and subcutaneous fat. And then there's also some physiological differences, like functional differences. When males and females tend to gain weight, they gain weight slightly differently, or actually a lot of times quite differently, because males tend to increase their visceral fat depots. So, and the fat depots that are in the visceral area tends to grow by hypertrophy, meaning the fat cells that are already there, they will start growing and becoming larger. And so you won't be recruiting as many new fat cells to differentiate. And that process is very important to recruit new fat cells, because when we look at female subcutaneous fat, or in general in subcutaneous fat, when the subcutaneous fat enlarges, it tends to recruit new fat cells. And then with that, and it recruits also new blood vessels. So there's more nutrition for those fat cells, because believe it or not, fat cells still need blood flow and nutrition for the few mitochondria that they have in there. And so they're more happy. But the visceral fat cells, when they enlarge, they a lot of times get further and further removed from the red blood cells and from the vasculature. And so they start becoming very unhappy. They're not getting the nutrients and oxygen that they need. They become hypoxic, and they start releasing a lot of cytokines that are kind of like their SOS signal, like we need more vasculature. But those are the same cytokines in humans that are also used to kind of signal inflammation. So they, as a kind of like a side effect, they end up increasing the inflammatory response within the human also. So when you enlarge your visceral fat, you end up enlarging more of the inflammatory response, more of the insulin resistance. But when you increase more of the subcutaneous fat, it seems to be more of kind of like this inert process where it's not really unhappy. It's like more happy and more content, I guess. And the cells are much smaller compared to the visceral fat cells.
So clearly it's obvious from your answer that visceral fat is a driving factor in inflammation in the body and leads to metabolic disease and a lot of other issues downstream. And to lower inflammation holistically for a body, whether you're obese or dealing with some kind of other metabolic disease that may have because you're obese or have caused obesity, it's contributing to a large amount of your inflammation and pain in your body.
It really is.
Would you maybe explain the, beyond visceral and subcutaneous fat, the different types of fat, the different functions they have? And then, cytokines are just signaling cells, essentially, that tell the body certain things to do. But maybe kind of go into detail a little bit more how cytokines work.
Yeah, for sure. So there's really three main types of fat, there's the three types of fat cells that are generalized or generally recognized to be. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly start charging my laptop. It started dying way faster than I realized. But sorry, back to our question. Yes, there's three main types of fat tissues. There's the white fat tissue, which is kind of like different types, the subcutaneous and the visceral. There is beige fat tissue, which is actually metabolically active, and a lot of times it will convert the fat into heat, and so you're kind of like burning the fat that goes in there. But that's a slower burning process than when you have the brown fat, which is the third type of fat. And those seem like they are coming from their own actually progenitor cells, cells that give rise to them. And those seem to be even more similar to muscle cells than they are to white fat or beige fat cells, which is very interesting. They have a lot of mitochondria, but instead of kind of taking the energy that the body has and turning into ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell that you use to do activity, but instead of that, they just burn that to generate heat. And usually in humans, since we don't expose ourselves to cold anymore, we actually don't have as much brown fat anymore. But in animal studies, its effect is really, really remarkable. So having brown fat seems to be correlated with reduced inflammation, and having more beiging fat seems to be correlated with reduced inflammation also. And so that seems to be a really good way to try to control I guess control body fat composition. And some people have started doing like the cold plunges and everything to try to regain some of that brown fat, but
that's why it's all the rage
more
nowadays.
Studies are needed. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, those are the main fat cells. And I think based on my understanding, the majority of the cytokines are coming from the white fat cells. And really, the inflammatory cytokines seem to be coming mainly from the visceral fat, at least based on my current understanding.
Okay. And then, I think it's important for people to understand that there's a difference between losing fat and burning fat. So, and I think this is going to lend into like our conversation about whether or not there's differences in energy expenditure between men and women. But, when it comes to burning fat, I think a lot of people forget that one of the, between carbohydrates and fats are the body's energy. It's how we generate energy. It's how the macronutrients that we use to generate energy. And I'm sure some of us remember in the 90s, early 2000s, carbs were bad. Fat was all the rage. And now, or maybe it's reversed, but anyway, it goes through cycles of like fat's bad, carbs are good, carbs are bad, fats are good. When in reality,
one of the macromolecules is always demonized, for
sure. Exactly. And in reality, we need both of them. And simply, they are just an energy source. And if you eat too much fat or too much carbs, you will gain fat if your energy balance is in a surplus. So I think it's also important for people to recognize that, there's a difference between using fat for energy and then losing fat. But I'm curious as like lending itself to energy expenditure between men and women, coming from like a nutritionist standpoint, when I prescribe clients like energy balance prescription, the equations that we use always account for women consuming less. And I'm wondering, and part of the equation is, we use the same metrics. We use, height in centimeters, the same value to multiply the height. And then we also use the same value to multiply the weight in kilograms. But the next number that's different is with men, we add 5 to the equation. With women, we subtract 161. And that's represented as kilocalories. Difference. It's a big difference. Right. So it's, from a nutritionist's perspective, it's like, okay, scientists have studied that women probably on average use less energy than men. And, all things accounted for, lean body mass, fat mass, is that actually true?
So when we look at males as a whole, I guess without like separating their body, I think part of the reason why males have potentially a higher basal metabolic rate is because they have more muscle mass. And that seems to be a big kind of like burner of your fat, burner of calories. It's a very metabolically expensive tissue to have. And so if you start fasting to lose weight and you don't have a lot of fat stores to begin with, or if you, for some reason, are fasting and you don't have a lot of fat stores, definitely your body will start burning muscle like crazy and you just lose muscle really fast. So it's really hard to sustain. Even when you do have baseline fat levels, a lot of times you will still lose protein actually and muscle when you're losing weight. And so I think currently it's recommended that if you're trying to lose weight, you increase your resistance training to kind of try to prevent the muscle loss. But in reality, I'm digressing. Muscle is very metabolically active and very metabolically expensive. And females tend to have lower amounts of muscle compared to males. And I see why that would, lead to different formulas for males compared to females. But it really, in reality, when looking, when considering regardless of their body mass, right, and body muscle mass, then we have to consider their brain function, and which is a really big part of their metabolic processes, and it doesn't seem like those are different. The only other thing that we can think of is the visceral fat compared to subcutaneous fat, and we do know that visceral fat tends to burn a little more like calories than the subcutaneous. Visceral fat in reality is not very inert, I guess, if that's the word. It tends to leak free fatty acids more, and so that could be partially the reason. In reality, like, it's hard to say, right? Especially since when we have looked at males compared to females, we've also done indirect calorimetry, and a lot of times those indirect calorimetry measurements have been kind of normalized between males and females using the body lean mass. But if the males already have higher body lean mass and you're subtracting the number by a larger, larger number, then you're going to get a smaller number. So it's kind of unclear as to to me at least, it's a little unclear as to why you would have large differences that you use in your formula.
Yeah,
that's very interesting.
To your point, all things considered, so people understand the basal metabolic rate that Rozeta was referring to is a human's basic needs to survive. So if you were just laying down and staring at the ceiling all day, that's the amount of energy your body would need to maintain all its current functions and neither lose or gain weight. And that is right. 75% of your caloric needs for the day.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
And a big driver of that, to your point, is your lean muscle mass. So all things considered,
actually,
your brain.
I would argue against that. Yeah, I think the brain is the biggest one, and
really?
Then muscle. Yeah.
Then I stand corrected. So yeah, the brain and then the muscle. So even then, all things considered, if you had a man and women that had a comparable amount of lean body mass, height, and weight, and assuming that they have the same amount of brain power, they should, all things equal, need the same caloric intake for their BMR.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Something to look into.
Yeah, I need to research
One
that.
more fat check point.
Yeah, one more fat check point. And I'm curious, when it comes to fat loss, we were talking about the difference between burning fat and fat loss. It's, I'll think the most elementary explain it like I'm five way to explain how to lose fat is to be in a caloric deficit, have your energy balance be in a deficit. When it comes to the mechanisms of fat loss, down to how, fat is lost in the human body, physiology, is there, more complicated? It's obviously more complicated than just eat less, because your hormones can come into play, metabolic adaptation can come into play. Yep. So, down to the, physiological levels, tiny little microscopic level, what is actually happening there?
Well,
and how can people take this and apply it to their life?
So a lot of things happen, really, and like you said, it's very complex and very context dependent, because I think the first part of your when you're fasting, I guess that's when normally your body needs to utilize the energy sources that it has stored. So it has probably stored your carbohydrates in the form of glycogen in the liver. Sometimes it can store actually the gluconeogenesis in the liver gets kind of sidetracked and you produce a little bit more fat, and some people get fatty liver, so you can actually store energy as fat in the liver also. Then you have your, of course, fat stores that have the actual triglycerides that have been forming from your free fatty acids, and then you have muscle. So those are your three main parts of energy sources.
Clarify that glucogenesis, what Rozeta said, is your body's process of using, like breaking down protein to turn it into glucose for energy.
Not always. Sometimes if you have a lot of glucose in your body, then your body actually will produce insulin, and then that will stop your liver from stop the glycolysis and then turn on the gluconeogenesis, which is okay, let's take these glucose molecules and build them into this storage thing and push it somewhere where we don't need it or don't see it. So if you have a lot of glucose and your body is sensitive enough to insulin, it will do that. But then again, let's say you're fasting now, right? You have these three sources that you're going to use from. I think it seems like first we start using from the glycogen sources. So we start breaking down that. And then at some point, I think hours after into fasting, then you start tapping into the fat stores. And then after that, you start tapping into the protein, like the muscle, also. And so a lot of that, it's more complicated, but like the overall process is kind of like first seems to be glycogen, then fat, then protein. So you need to make sure that you don't have a lot of blood glucose when you're trying to fast. Like you need to make sure that, you're not drinking sugary fluids and such when you're fasting.
I want to touch on that, but you just reminded me of an article I read about a study that was done. I don't know if it was more of an experiment. And this guy in the 70s in the UK was largely obese, and what they did was, they wanted to see how long he could technically fast, because excess fat on the body is just excess energy that our body didn't know what to do with. He was something like 350 pounds. He did not eat for over a year. Wow. He only consumed coffee with sugar, like a little bit of sugar. I think it was under 300 calories a day, which is nothing. And I don't recommend this process at all for anybody, because this does not teach sustainable or healthy habits or a positive relationship with food. But he was able to fast for over a year and lost all the weight.
I see. I guess I see how that could work, because if your baseline of consumption of sugar was really high, and you just reduce it down to just 1 cup of coffee or however many he had with a little bit of sugar, then your body is still oh, we're not getting what we're used to. We are in a fasting state, because really your body is a very smart but also a really interesting system. And it's whenever you start increasing some sort of level of macronutrient or anything, really any stimuli, that becomes eventually the normal, the new normal. And so your body will get used to that. And then eventually, I guess, if you start cutting it really fast, then it will definitely go into that kind of fasted mode and be this is not normal for us. We need to start burning more fuel to create energy. That would make sense to me.
I would love to talk. Excuse me. I would love to talk more about fasting, because it's, intermittent fasting is all the rage these days. And a lot of my clients, when they come to tell, hey, what do you think about intermittent fasting? The way I learned this process was when I was working with a dietitian, and I asked him that, and he said, Noah, do you know who invented intermittent fasting? And I was like, no, I don't know. He's like, our caveman ancestors. They would hunt and gather, and they would eat and gorge themselves because they didn't know when the next meal would be. And that was their intermittent fasting. So, from my understanding, the intermittent fasting protocols that people follow of eat for 8 hours, fast for 16 hours, the benefits that you would get from fasting has to extend longer than 24 hours. for like increased cognitive function and increased fat loss. And I'm wondering if in any of your research you've come across data that, either validates, or no, that's not how you say it, validates the 1816 fasting IF protocol, or if people do want to fast, does it have to be 24 hours plus?
So most of the studies that I'm familiar with are the studies with the time restricted eating and fasting of like somewhere between, like you said, 8 hours and 16 hours. And I think a lot of these studies were actually, it's really funny how there's a scientist at Salk Institute, Sachin Panda, and his group was one of the first ones to really shed light into intermittent fasting and time restricted eating. And the grad student who was working on that project, apparently he had a girlfriend who was like, the longest I allow you to be in the lab is like 10 hours, because he had to like set up the experiment and then like collect the data and then finish the experiment. So he had to restrict the time restricting window to the 8 hours.
That's
it
funny.
wasn't like there wasn't a physiological reason for that. They just like had to do that for the, I guess, mental health of the grad student, which is very important. And so they ended up going with that time restricted kind of eating window for the animals. And that was one of the first ones to come up with. And so I feel like that started that like, 8 hours is the best kind of strategy. And a lot of the clinical trials followed that strategy. But I think recently there's more studies that are like playing around with the window. And it seems like the benefits are still there, even when your time restriction is longer, or like you restrict your window to, let's say, 10 hours instead of the 8 hours.
Can you go more into like what the benefits are? Because, looking at it from a fat loss perspective, the reason that intermittent fasting works, if you do it correctly, it's because you're essentially removing a meal from your day. So you're inherently consuming less energy, so you're going to be in a deficit. I think a lot of my clients who see intermittent fasting as like, if I just skip breakfast but eat the same things in the next 8 hours, I'll be fine. They never see the results they want. So, I'm curious, what are the benefits of, intermittent fasting or time restricted eating?
Right. So in the animal studies that they had started with, actually some of the animals had high fat diet, or the high fat diet, they call it high fat, but it's high fat and high sugar diet that they were eating. And so there were two groups of animals. One group was eating the high fat, high sugar diet, the same amount of calories, like the amount that they wanted at the times that they wanted to, versus the other group was given the same amount of calories, but within this window. And so it seems like it wasn't the amount of the calories, at least for the mice, but it was the time restricted kind of like portion of their eating that was the beneficial, because the mice that were eating the same calories and were eating the high fat diet, but were eating it within that time restricted window, they actually had, I believe, lower insulin resistance, and they also had reduced markers of fatty liver. So
Interesting.
Yes. So a lot of those markers seemed to be reversed with. But then again, when we try to repeat that, like, mice are not humans, right? As great as they are for like a starting kind of like experimental design to understand how the physiology works, it's not exactly the same in humans. And all the studies that have done in humans, it seems like it's really hard to eat the same amount of calories in a shorter window compared to eating throughout the day. So it almost seems like all of the studies that I'm familiar with, at least, that looked in humans, end up having a calorie restriction portion to it to begin with. So it's really hard to separate that, whether or not in humans, is it because of the reduced calories, or is it because of the kind of like the intermittent fasting that they're getting this benefits. But then there's also this other component to it where we know that eating in the earlier part of your like waking cycle, when you wake up and you're active during the day, and whenever your cycle is, whenever you eat at the earlier part of your cycle, your daily active cycle, it seems like that is correlated with improved insulin sensitivity over if you do the same time restriction, but then at the second part of the cycle, or like, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that people probably gravitate towards skipping breakfast, so they just roll right into their day. And when they're at home in the evening, it's easier not to. It's easier to eat then, because often people get bored in their evening.
Right.
Like, what am I going to do? I'm going
Right.
to eat. But I always recommend people have a big breakfast and a smaller
Exactly.
dinner, because, like you said, when you start your day, you need energy. You just fasted already for 8 hours, so you need energy to get through your day. So
Actually, if you ate within 8 hours, then you probably fasted for, what is it, 16? Oh, close to 10 or 12, because there's like residual food. But then one thing, sorry, that I had to interrupt you to say this, but there's another important component, is that human physiology and human hormones are very directly linked with the amount of sunlight that they're getting. So the sun that you see during the day is not just for your visuals, for you to be able to see, but it also acts in, it goes through the eye, goes into the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and goes to the brain and signals to brain that, oh, like, we're awake now. We're going to start producing insulin. We're going to start producing all these other hormones. So insulin sensitivity seems to be highest in the morning, or like after the first 1 or 2 hours of waking. That's when it seems to be highest, and then it goes like in 2 cycles, and then eventually towards the evenings it's actually low. So eating a big meal in the evening is also detrimental for that reason.
Yeah, and it's harder to fall asleep too, because your body is working on digesting
Yes.
instead of resting. And so that lends itself to the idea and encouragement that, like, one of the best things you can do the first thing in your day is get some sunlight.
And then one thing that food does to your body is also, like, it shifts your circadian rhythm. So if you eat in the evening, like when you consume like a really large food, it makes you kind of sleepy, right? It can make you still sleepy, but you will not be able to get the same quality of sleep that you would if you were fasted, because it does affect your circadian rhythm in the body. And a lot of the deep restorative sleep, it seems like, is affected if you eat too late.
Yeah, I always recommend people eat 3 hours before they go to sleep. And
yeah, I think that's a good...
I don't know if you know much about caffeine intake, but I also always try to encourage people to wait at least 90 minutes after they wake up to consume coffee or tea or caffeine of their choice, just because, like you said, there's so much beneficial physiological things that happen when we get sunlight. And if you're starting your day with taking caffeine, which caffeine doesn't give you energy, it essentially stops your body, like a hormone. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it like blocks your body from feeling tired. It doesn't actually give you energy, it just stops you from feeling tired. When you introduce caffeine to your body won't even get the chance to start
waking
to
up
itself and waking up. Exactly. So that's another reason to hold off on caffeine, because if you let your body do its thing, it'll be better for your metabolism.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That's what I try to do for myself also. And I think you were talking about the adenosine receptors were like in the brain that in the brain that like signal to your body, or like, the adenosine binds to its receptors, it signals that you're tired, but then caffeine will like bind to all of those, and then the adenosine is stuck in your bloodstream. So when the caffeine wears off at like 2 p.m., right, you get like all this extra adenosine binding, and because you also accumulated during the day more of that. And so at the end you get a crash at 2 p.m. if you drink your coffee too early.
We've all experienced that. I would, I feel like I skipped this when we were talking about like the difference in metabolism between men and women. So like androgens, which is like basically testosterone, the male hormone, low androgen in men increases risk for insulin resistance, whereas high androgen in women, in the population of women that have PCOS, becomes a risk factor for insulin resistance. And I was wondering, like, the mechanisms behind why that is, if you can speak to it.
I can speak to it a little bit. It's I think both of those are like, and honestly, most of the conditions that we're talking about today are very complex, and the underlying mechanisms, there's like multiple. A lot of times it's more than one mechanism, and there's a few things that kind of like comes to mind as to like what could be a potential contributor to that. So when we look at one of them would be kind of when we look at androgens and we look at estrogens, they need their specific context to work. And I'll have to dive into more molecular biology than most people are interested in, so forgive me for that. And bear with me. Hopefully it makes sense to you at the end.
I'm ready for it.
If not, I'm pretty sure Noah can translate it afterwards into like more English,
Explain it like I'm 5.
And honestly, like one thing that my professor would always tell me, if you can't explain it simple enough for someone who doesn't study science to understand it, then do you even understand it? That's how she would always put it. And I would always get upset, but now it makes a lot of sense because it's easy to like regurgitate things from memory, but really explaining it like in a more simple way, and like removing all the details that are unnecessary. It's definitely a skill and like a different level of understanding. Anyways, back to our mechanism number one. So androgens, estrogens, let's start with estrogens. They will have specific DNA parts that they bind to. Actually, they go through the cell and the cell membrane to the nucleus, and then eventually bind your DNA and actually activate certain genes. And for that to happen, your DNA, like the DNA is not like linear, right? In the cell, it's like so long that it has to be super coiled in like really tight shapes to be able to like hold it within the tiny nucleus that we have inside our cells. And so what happens that there's a lot of like genes and a lot of proteins that control kind of like where your DNA is open and which part of those DNA elements are accessible so that the genes can get expressed. And so for estrogen to get to its target genes, there has to be an opening in there. And so that's controlled by histone modifier genes. And some of those genes I mentioned that are on the X chromosomes. So for example, KDM5C, KDM6A, histone demethylases, they tend to change the shape of your DNA at specific parts of your DNA. And so having different dosage of those genes between males and females is actually going to set the stage of like, oh, like this part of my DNA is going to be more open. So these specific elements are going to be more accessible to estrogen to work with. And so these genes are going to be responding as a result, versus within the male physiology, if you have other histone demethylases that are acting other downstream effects will happen. So you see how like with the same starting material, you end up with two different products because your context is very different.
Okay, no, that makes sense. I think it's just basically comes down to how a man and women's bodies processes the estrogen or androgen differently.
Yeah, exactly. It's the response to it.
All right, interesting. That makes a lot of sense.
One thing that's also,
I was going to say, now that you said that after I asked the question, I was like, oh, that is kind of obvious.
Well, it's not really, right? Like it may not be as obvious to like someone who doesn't study physiology or like. Fair. It wasn't to me, at least, until I started studying this.
That's fair. That is fair. I'm curious, I think nutrition and diets are so dogmatic these days. What's like, is keto the best? Is low carb? Is high carb? Is high pro? Is carnivore? On the more extreme side of things. In your experience and all the research you've done, studies, is there one style of eating, method of eating, that seems to be the best for long-term health when it comes to, lower metabolic disease, lower fat accumulation, or, just all around better health?
Are you talking about a specific macronutrient, like more carb heavy versus fat
Maybe
heavy,
more specific,
or?
like most people can think of like blue zones. So where blue zones have the highest concentration of centennials, people that live over 100. Generally, people in those zones eat a more Mediterranean style diet. So
Omega
are
3s.
there? So I guess I just said the answer. So is that true? Or are there other modalities, styles of eating that are just as conducive to lowering metabolic disease and better markers of health?
Honestly, I think omega 3s seem to be the most promising as of now. But if you're already doing that, that doesn't mean that you can't like top it off with other things, and see if you can even outlive the centenarians, right? And it's not even just like about like how long you live, right? It's also about the quality of your life. And
Exactly.
honestly, a lot of those people who live long, it's because they're healthy for a longer time. And yes, like you alluded to, Mediterranean diet, because of the high omega-3 content, seems to be all around good for potentially everyone. And there are other things that seem to be good. But honestly, a lot of our clinical trials, I get a little upset because unfortunately, that's the part of science where like we can't really control a lot. We have to take the patients who are willing to participate in the clinical trial. And unfortunately, these tend to be in areas where there's more of certain ethnic background of people and certain sexes. And so a lot of times we can't even be choosy when we're, looking for participants. And so a lot of these studies have been done for, I guess, more of the European descent. A lot of times males, but some females also. But it seems like this is a mechanism that could potentially benefit everyone, and that's mainly because when I look at all of the cultures, they all seem to have this particular food, and fermented foods. So that's what I'm trying to get into. I think I think inflammation is a big marker, or like a big driver of eventual insulin resistance. And sometimes I think it could be co-occurring at the same time. And it seems like having higher levels of beneficial gut bacteria in your intestines is correlated with lower inflammatory biomarkers. And unfortunately, the ultra-processed food that we eat nowadays, and we eat a lot of it, tends to kill off those bacteria, because the fiber that we would normally get from the unprocessed foods would be a food for them. And so as a result, they would help us kind of like slower our inflammatory kind of system down. It was like a very beneficial, symbiotic relationship between humans and bacteria. But now that we're not feeding them, we're eating these ultra digestible foods that don't have any fiber. Those bacterial populations tend to be killed off. And so studies show that even if you stop eating the ultra processed foods and start eating high fiber foods, you actually will not gain those populations of bacteria that you once had back, unless you start eating fermented food. Then the bacteria that are in those fermented foods can populate your gut again, and then you start forming new symbiotic relationships.
So eat more fermented foods for
Kimchi.
probiotics, kimchi, sauerkraut,
Greek yogurt,
kefir.
Yes.
You can also buy live culture probiotic supplements as well. And then also make sure you're consuming fiber, which is a prebiotic, which feeds the good bacteria.
Yes,
in your
you don't
body.
want to starve them. You don't want to
Exactly.
eat them and then starve them.
and probiotics are just adding other good bacteria to your microbiome. So, as far as like key takeaways go for this podcast episode, so far I understand that omega-3s, so consuming healthy fats, is extremely important for metabolic health and helping with fat loss if that is a goal of yours. Eating fiber, prebiotics, and consuming probiotic foods. And a healthy lifestyle, as in like movement and happiness. Because I know you were saying
sure.
a lot of the centennials that live in the blue zones, it's also their lifestyle that they choose. They're active, low stress, etc. Actually, I'm curious.
Good sleep.
As my good sleep. Yeah. My last question is stress. How? No.
That's a hard one.
This is a hard one.
I think that's the hardest one to control.
Yeah. Stress is like, stress is a killer. Stress, whether it's like chronic stress is a killer. Some acute stress is great. Chronic stress can lead to high levels of inflammation. Are there any studies that you've seen or been a part of that has shown how increased stress markers influence fat accumulation on the body?
Yeah, it seems like it seems to be related to cortisol levels, because when your stress levels go up, and actually every day our cortisol level goes up right before we wake up, and that helps us be alert when we wake up. And so the cyclicity, like having a little bit of cortisol in the morning to help you wake up and feel alert. Sometimes people will do cold exposure to increase their cortisol levels and adrenaline and feel more alert that way also. But when you're under chronic stress, the cortisol levels are continuously high, and that actually ends up, I believe, shutting down or really reducing your basal metabolic rate. And so you tend to feel more sleepy and feel more tired, but it's partially because your like metabolic rate is reduced, so you're not getting the energy you need to feel more alert. So your body is just like kind of like insulin resistant, but it's kind of like cortisol resistance in your body. That's how I see it, at least. And so that ends up kind of accumulating. And I think people who are stressed tend to actually increase their food intake also. The majority of times. There's also people who do the opposite. That's also true. But yeah, in reality, it's reduced basal metabolic rate, it seems like.
So interesting. So omega-3s, pre and probiotics, sleep, keep your stress low, and be happy.
And if you can, do intermittent fasting.
Do intermittent fasting. Well, Rozeta, I've learned so much in this podcast. I cannot wait to go back and re-listen to it multiple times. If people want to hear more about the work that you're doing, or if you have a podcast or anything that you want to share with people, what is the best way for people to find you or read more about what you're doing?
Well, I guess you can share my Instagram account if you would like.
I'll put it in the bio.
Sounds good. And I can add my Twitter account for that. Whenever our lab or like very interesting articles comes out, I will try to share those and explain those articles. But I potentially will start a podcast one day. And if I do, you will know it from the Instagram account, I guess.
Love it. I'm excited for that to come out. Well, again, thank you so much. I cannot wait to hear all the positive things people are going to take away and apply and learn from this podcast. You were an incredible guest, and thank you again so much for being on Fat Kid Fit Pod. We really appreciate it.
It's been so fun being here. I really enjoyed that conversation. I think your questions are very insightful, and I feel like you really know much more than you kind of like show. So it comes through your questions. It's great to talk to someone who's very knowledgeable and kind of like has like really good insight.
I appreciate you saying that. I'm very much into self-deprecating humor, so I like to think that like I come across as a bumbling gorilla, and I like to surprise people with intelligence sometimes. Not to say the gorillas are not intelligent.
I do that too.
But well, I will put her Instagram and her Twitter in the description for the podcast, and I know that Rozeta is definitely going to have to be a guest again, because fat is a topic that can be talked about a lot, and there's obviously a lot of mechanisms and parts that we didn't even touch upon in this podcast. So stay tuned for the next time Rozeta's on, and thank you so much for listening and being a part of this podcast. Peace out, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope I have inspired and motivated you. I hope your inner fat kid is more proud of you today than they were before this. Fitness is a journey everyone should start, but no one should finish. So whether you're continuing or starting yours, I am so glad that we get to be a part of each other's. With Fitness, Noah.